January 29th, 1999. The town of Manassas, Virginia, was winding down from an ordinary winter day. It was the kind of afternoon when school buses rumbled along quiet streets, kids rushed home to drop their backpacks by the door, and families prepared for the weekend just ahead. There was nothing remarkable about it, just another cold, still day in a suburban community where people believed their homes were safe. But behind the walls of one modest brick house, safety was about to shatter. By the time the sun set, tragedy would strike the Reed family in a way no one could have imagined. A bright 16-year-old would lose her life. Her younger sister, only 14, would endure a brutal ordeal that left her permanently scarred. And the community would be left reeling, asking the question that haunts so many small towns when violence erupts so close to home. How could this happen here? The answer was chilling. The attacker was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. He was someone the family recognized, a young man already known in the neighborhood. His name was Paul Warner Powell. He was just 20 years old. But in one afternoon, he committed acts that would not only devastate a family, but also launch one of Virginia's most infamous capital murder cases. This story is not only about the crime itself, but also about what followed. Because Powell didn't stop at violence. After being arrested, he chose to write letters, arrogant, taunting letters, that prosecutors would later use to turn his own words into the key evidence that sealed his fate. The story of Paul Warner Powell is one of murder, survival, and a legal battle that stretched for more than a decade, ending in the electric chair. And it all began on that quiet January afternoon. On January 29th, 1999, Powell went to the home of sisters Stacie and Kristie Reed. It wasn't unusual for him to be around. He had crossed paths with them before, but this time, he came with something darker on his mind. Inside the house, Stacie was home first. She was a teenager full of potential, with her future still ahead of her. That day, she had no reason to suspect that opening the door would be the last act of her young life. What happened next unfolded quickly. Powell attacked, stabbing Stacie once in the chest. The single wound struck her heart, leaving no chance of survival. The moment was over in seconds, but it changed everything forever. Then came the most chilling part of the story. Powell didn't leave the house. Instead, he stayed. He knew Kristie, just 14 years old, would soon walk through the door after school. He waited for her. When Kristie entered her home, she stepped into a nightmare. Powell forced her into the basement, a place that should have been safe but became the scene of terror. There, he assaulted her, stabbed her multiple times, and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Against all odds, Kristie survived. She would later wake up, disoriented and badly injured, but alive. Her survival was both miraculous and pivotal, because her voice would become the most powerful testimony against Powell. She could tell investigators what happened. She could identify the man who had destroyed her family. By the time the evening fell over Manassas, the Reed family's world was shattered. One daughter was gone. The other was fighting through unimaginable pain. And the young man who caused it all, Paul Warner Powell, had set himself on a course that would end not in freedom, but in a courtroom, and years later in an execution chamber. Before we proceed, let's even look into the background of Paul Warner Powell's execution. Who was he really? And what led him down the path to that January day in 1999? Paul Warner Powell was born in 1978 and raised in Virginia. To many who knew him casually, he seemed like an ordinary young man. He wasn't wealthy, nor did he stand out for any particular achievements. But beneath the surface, there were warning signs, a simmering anger, a tendency to fixate, and beliefs that would later shock even seasoned prosecutors. By his late teens, Powell had embraced ideas rooted in prejudice and hostility. Those close to him described a young man who spoke often about race and identity, who aligned himself with extremist views, and who seemed to carry resentment as a constant companion. It wasn't just abstract ideology. Powell became fixated on Stacie Reed, the teenager who would later become his victim. She represented something he wanted but could not have: her attention, her acceptance, her approval. When she rejected him and moved forward with her own life, including a relationship that challenged his worldview, Powell's bitterness deepened. Prosecutors would later argue that it was this toxic blend, personal rejection fueled by extremist ideas, that created the motive for what happened in 1999. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it offers a chilling glimpse into how resentment can harden into violence. By the time Powell was 20 years old, those beliefs and emotions had shaped him into someone capable of destroying lives in a single afternoon. In 2000, the case went to trial. Powell faced the full weight of the law, charged with capital murder for Stacie's death and multiple other crimes against Kristie. The evidence was overwhelming. Kristie Reed had survived to tell her story. She pointed directly to Powell as her attacker. Forensic evidence supported her testimony, leaving little room for doubt. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented a picture of deliberate violence. They argued that this wasn't a random act. Powell had entered the Reed home with intent, had murdered Stacie, and then assaulted Kristie in a calculated, terrifying sequence. The defense had few options. With Kristie alive to testify and the evidence stacked against their client, their strategy could not erase the facts. Jurors listened intently. The atmosphere was tense, with reporters filling the benches and community members watching every word. For the Reed family, sitting through the details was painful beyond measure, but they stayed, determined to see justice carried out. When deliberations ended, the jury returned with a clear verdict. Powell was guilty of capital murder. The sentence, death. For the community, it felt like resolution. For the Reed family, it was a measure of accountability. But for Powell, it was only the beginning of a legal journey that would twist in ways no one expected. In the American legal system, every death sentence is subject to appeals. And in Powell's case, those appeals brought a surprising outcome. In 2001, the Virginia Supreme Court reviewed the case. Their ruling shocked many. Powell's capital murder conviction and the death sentence that came with it would be overturned. The reason? The court found that the indictment, the formal charge brought against Powell, had not been framed correctly. Even more critically, they ruled that the evidence prosecutors used to elevate the case to capital murder status, specifically whether a sexual assault had occurred alongside the killing, was not sufficiently proven at trial. This meant Powell was still guilty of murder, but it also meant that for the time being, he was no longer facing execution. For Powell, this reversal felt like a victory. In his mind, it wasn't just a technicality. He believed it meant the state could never again pursue a death sentence against him. He thought double jeopardy, the rule against being tried twice for the same crime, was now his shield. But he was wrong. In the eyes of the law, when a conviction is overturned because of errors in procedure, the door remains open for a new trial. Powell didn't understand that, and in his false confidence, he made a mistake so severe that it would ultimately send him back to death row. After the reversal, Powell sat in jail, convinced he had outsmarted the system. And that's when he did something almost unthinkable. He began to write. From his cell, Powell drafted letters to prosecutors and others involved in the case. They weren't letters of remorse or appeals for mercy. They were letters of arrogance. In them, he mocked the justice system and bragged about what he had done. Even worse for him, he revealed details about Stacie Reed's death that prosecutors had struggled to prove in the first trial. He described what happened in ways that erased any doubt about whether sexual assault had been attempted. Powell believed he was safe. He thought these admissions couldn't hurt him, but the reality was very different. His letters became the missing link prosecutors needed. They transformed a case that had once been shaky on a technicality into a rock-solid capital murder prosecution. For the Reed family, hearing about these letters was another painful blow. The man who had destroyed their lives wasn't just guilty, he was boasting about it. For prosecutors, the letters were both disturbing and invaluable. They had been handed the very evidence they needed, written in Powell's own hand. In trying to prove his own cleverness, Paul Warner Powell had instead built the case that would ultimately lead him back to death row. When prosecutors prepared to retry Paul Warner Powell, they had something rare, the defendant's own words written in his own hand. Those letters weren't just admissions. They were taunts. To a jury, they spoke louder than any testimony. The second trial began in 2003. The courtroom was again filled with reporters, community members, and the Reed family who had already endured one trial and years of appeals. This time, prosecutors wasted no time. They presented Kristie Reed's testimony, the forensic record, and then introduced Powell's letters. Jurors leaned in as the words were read aloud. Powell had mocked the system and bragged about what he had done, under the false belief that nothing more could happen to him. But here, in black and white, were the very details that prosecutors needed to reestablish the capital murder charge. For the defense, the situation was impossible. How could they counter Powell's own words? They argued that the letters were the product of arrogance, not accuracy, but the damage was done. The jury could see for themselves that Powell wasn't denying anything. The verdict came swiftly. Once again, Powell was convicted of capital murder. And once again, the jury sentenced him to death. By 2004, the Virginia Supreme Court affirmed the conviction. Powell had closed the door on himself. What he thought was clever defiance had become the nail in his own coffin. The Powell case quickly became more than just a tragedy for the Reed family. It became a legal landmark, a case studied for the way it tested the boundaries of constitutional law. The first major issue was double jeopardy. Powell believed that because his first death sentence had been overturned, he could never face that charge again. But the law makes a clear distinction. When a conviction is reversed due to errors in procedure, the state can retry. Double jeopardy doesn't protect someone in that situation. Powell misunderstood this, and his arrogance in writing those letters sealed his fate. The second issue was aggravating factors. In Virginia, not every murder can be prosecuted as capital murder. The law requires additional proof that another serious felony, like sexual assault, occurred in connection with the killing. At Powell's first trial, that element wasn't fully established, which is why the conviction was overturned. But when Powell described his actions in his letters, prosecutors suddenly had the evidence they needed. His words turned the case from ordinary murder into capital murder once again. These legal points make the Powell case a staple in law school classrooms and appellate rulings. But for the Reed family, they weren't abstract concepts. They were years of hearings, retrials, and reliving the most painful day of their lives. By the late 2000s, Powell's legal options were gone. He had appealed at every level: state courts, federal courts, even the U.S. Supreme Court. Each time, his conviction and death sentence were upheld. On March 18, 2010, the state of Virginia prepared for his execution at Greensville Correctional Center. Unlike most inmates who chose lethal injection, Powell requested electrocution, an option still available under Virginia law at the time. His choice drew attention, as the electric chair had become a rare method by then. That evening, the process unfolded with quiet precision. Witnesses, including members of the media and the victim's family, were escorted into the chamber. Powell was brought in, secured, and offered the chance to speak final words. He declined. The silence was striking. Just one day earlier, Powell had spoken briefly by phone with members of the Reed family, acknowledging that his crime had been senseless. But in his final moments, he had nothing more to say. At 9:09 p.m., Paul Warner Powell was pronounced dead. For the Reed family, the execution ended a legal journey that had consumed more than a decade. It could never restore what they lost, but it did close the final chapter in a case that had defined their lives since 1999. Even after Powell's execution, his case continues to spark debate. Did Powell's extremist beliefs and resentment drive him to commit murder? Or was it simply the toxic mix of anger and opportunity on that January day? Did the justice system achieve closure by carrying out the execution? Or did the years of reversals and retrials only prolong the family's suffering? And perhaps the most haunting question, if Powell had never written those letters, would he still be alive today, serving a life sentence instead of facing the electric chair? His own arrogance turned out to be his undoing. Without those words, prosecutors may never have secured the death penalty a second time. For legal scholars, the case is a lesson in how the smallest details can change the course of justice. For the Reed family, it will always be the story of a life cut short, another life permanently scarred, and a man whose choices left behind nothing but pain. So that is the story of Paul Warner Powell. A crime that devastated a family, a trial that seemed final, only to unravel. Letters that turned arrogance into evidence, and an execution that ended a life, but not the questions. Cases like Powell's remind us that justice is rarely simple. It is a process shaped by laws, courts, and sometimes by the very choices of the guilty themselves. So I'll leave it to you. Was Powell's execution justice served? Or was it a story of a system stretched to its limits, caught between procedure and punishment? If you want to keep exploring cases that challenge our understanding of guilt, innocence, and the meaning of justice, make sure to like this video, share it with others who care about uncovering the truth, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the world of true crime. The answers are never easy, but the search for them never stops.